thanks to the organizer, obviously, to put together this meeting and inviting me. It's really a very exciting 2 days. I'm also very pleased to be here because it's not my first time in Dartmouth, and I've already been twice here before as a fellow of the Summer Institute in Cognitive Neuroscience a few years back, and I think it was really a tremendous experience. So I would like to extend my thanks to Michael Getzeniga and all the people who had put that together at the time. And, it was fantastic. Voices. So none of the sounds that you've heard were speech sounds. Nevertheless, we were all able to extract much information from them. And that's the bottom line of the talk, is that voices, exactly like faces, the point has already been made by the two previous speakers, is very rich in information. Obviously, there is speech, and this is the type of voice information that most people think about when you talk of voice, but there's also much more. In the sounds that we heard, although there were no speech sounds, we were still able to extract information first, recognize that the sounds had been produced by a conspecific human being, and also extract information on their identity, affective state, and so on. So that's the, in addition to speech, voice contains much socially relevant person-related information on the biological characteristics of the speaker, the physiological state, and also some more subtle social traits, such as attractiveness, trustworthiness, and dominance. So in this sense, we can really consider the voice as an auditory phase. And I would like to extend this parallel to the underlying neurophysiological mechanisms, suggesting that, in fact, the mechanism, the cerebral organization for extracting voice information is very similar to the one proposed, and in particular by Bruce and Young, but others. Really the fact that there seems to be a unified coding strategy for processing faces and voices. So the starting point is really the Bruce and Young model, suggesting that after a stage of, a common stage of structural analysis, where, as Stefan Schweiger described, we have probably this detection of face-like configuration, then the various different types of facial information are processed in interacting but independent pathways, meaning pathways that interact with one another during normal behavior, but that can be selectively impaired from one another. What we proposed a number of years ago, and I think it's still fairly valid, is that roughly the same general architecture can be proposed as well to be valid for voices. And that's basically the structure of the talk. Would like first to discuss a little bit of the work that suggests that there is also a stage of voice structural analysis comparable to the one set for faces. So we know this, all the studies using fMRI in particular showing that there are face patches or face areas in human and the macaque visual cortex. We showed that there's the similar phenomenon in auditory cortex, that if you contrast, if you scan subjects, measure their brain activity while they listen to a number of natural sounds, and if you divide these sounds in two categories according to whether they've been produced by a human vocal tract or not. So these sounds are fairly complex, variable, so they activate a lot of the auditory cortex when you compare them to baseline. And same thing for the complex non-vocal sounds that can be matched in complexity and variety of sources and so on. So both these category of stimuli are really rich and excite a lot the auditory cortex, but and at the naked eye, you don't see much difference between the two. But when you compare statistically the patterns of brain activity elicited by these two categories, you see that in most people, there are specific areas, mostly located along the superior-temporal sulcus and the superior-temporal gyrus, bilaterally, that prefer voices, that show a greater activity in response to voices. There's a fair amount of variability in these so-called temporal voice areas that here are represented on the superior-temporal sulcus, and here's an example of these voice areas in 20 different individuals, showing really the very strong anatomical and also functional variability of location, but all these subjects show these voice areas. Recently, a cluster analysis of a large number, over 200 subjects who participated to this 10-minute voice localizer, suggests that, in fact, there are 3 voice patches along the STG, STS, in fairly symmetrical areas along the supratemporal sulcus and gyrus. But these voice patches are by no means the only regions of the brain that are interested in voices. When we do a random effects analysis, so averaging the data obtained in these 200 subjects, of course, there is a lot of voice selective activity in the temporal lobe, but we see that there's also additional regions, in particular inferior prefrontal regions and the amygdala, that show reliable sensitivity to these voices. As for the faces, we also there is also electrophysiological signatures for these voice responses, and in particular, we identified using EEG the counterpart of the N170 component that Stefan discussed earlier, where by contrasting different categories of stimuli, voice stimuli in red here compared to bird songs and environmental sounds, we find that in symmetrical areas, not occipitotemporal like for the N170, but this time frontotemporal areas of the scalp, there is reliable differences that start to emerge fairly early and that peak at around 200 milliseconds, where really at the naked eye we see that there's a much greater amplitude for these voice stimuli at the latency very comparable to the one of the N170. And more recently we've shown the same the magnetic counterpart of this so-called frontotemporal positivity to voice, whereas we don't see any difference between vocal and non-vocal sounds at the level of the N100, but at the level of the FTPV at around 200 milliseconds, we have a significant difference between face and voice, and source localization suggests that these regions correspond to areas along the STG, STS, very similar to the ones that we observe with the fMRI. An important question is whether humans are the only people to have these voice areas. And we know that humans are the only species that speak, so maybe we are also the only ones to have these voice areas. The answer to the question was provided by Chris Petkoff in Nikos Logothetis' lab, where they used fMRI, very similar to the approach that the first speaker this morning described. We're using exactly the same methodology, fMRI, in the awake, either anesthetized or awake monkey, and contrasting categories of sound that either macaque vocalizations or different categories of complex vocal sounds. And in the macaques as well as in the humans, we see that there are regions here in orange that show a significant preference to conspecific vocalizations. And interestingly, they're also located more in the right hemisphere in this anterior and the anterior temporal region, fairly similar to what we see in the human brain. This is very interesting because it suggests that these areas, these voice areas, did not just appear in the past 10 or hundreds of thousands of years along with speech, but were already probably present in the last common ancestor of macaque and humans some 25 to 30 million years ago. Similar to the strategy presented now, once these voice patches have been identified in the macaque, it's possible to do electrophysiological recordings in them, single-cell recordings, and this is still work done by Catherine Perrodin and Chris Petkoff in Nikos Logothetis' lab, and they find that indeed in this anterior voice patch here, there's a large proportion of neurons that are themselves voice sensitive. So nothing as far as close to 95% of face cells that were observed in the face patches, but still a fairly significant proportion of neurons that are individually voice selective. So the existence of voice cells as well in the macaque brain. In fact, interestingly, quite recently, it was also shown that these voice areas exist in the dog. So people training dogs to lie still in the scanner, which is in fact perhaps an interesting alternative strategy to training the macaques. And these dogs show, as you can see here, some region that also show this sensitivity to conspecific vocalizations, preference to conspecific vocalization than other types of sounds, suggesting, again, the existence of voice areas in the dog brain, and really pushing back the probable origin in time of these voice areas as far as 100 million years ago, the last common ancestor of dogs and humans. So a very long history of cerebral voice processing. Now, of course, what we do with voices is recognize individuals, and Stefan Schweinberger earlier has alluded a little bit to this. We're interested in trying to understand the mechanism by which we can extract the identity of individuals simply by their voice, allowing us to recognize these individuals by the voice. When you hear these sounds,
pod, 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 pod.
We clearly recognize that it was the same phoneme, but spoken by different individuals. And we could, even though we are not familiar with these individuals, we can recognize really that they are different individuals and start to form some sort of representation of the vocal signature of different individuals. How do we do this? Clearly, there's acoustical differences. So for those of you who are not familiar with sound, these are spectrograms. So this time here on the x-axis, and y is the frequency, and the color represents the amount of acoustical energy. We can see that there's fairly diverse, important variability between these different sounds. For example, the frontal frequency, the pitch of the voice, so the spacing between different harmonics can vary quite a lot between individuals. The melody, the pattern of the speech contour changes, also the distribution of energy across the spectrum. So there's a number of acoustical cues that our system can use to form this representation of individuals. A number of studies over the past decade or so have repeatedly involved the structures of the anterior temporal lobe in the perception of these vocal signatures of different individuals. And I don't have time to detail these studies, but perhaps the most compelling study was the one by the group of Elia Formizano in Maastricht, where they used MVPA and pattern classification methods to identify the groups of voxels that allowed a classifier to successfully classify phonemes, here in red, that are represented fairly bilaterally in auditory cortex, or to successfully classify the speaker. And we see here in blue, and the map here is much more lateralized, involving much more right lateralized anterior regions of the temporal lobe, a little bit like shown in previous studies using more classical univariate analysis. What we're interested in a study I'm about to present is trying to understand a little bit better the code with which identity is represented in these structures. And again, we turn to influential studies in face processing, and in particular this study by David Leopold and colleagues, where they recorded single-cell action potentials in, I think it's in cells of the inferior temporal lobe, in response to a variety of faces that varied in identity. And they were varying in identity in a very specific way, from faces that were the so-called prototypical face, the identity-neutral face, or 0% identity face that is simply generated by averaging through computer many different exemplars of different faces. And indeed, when you use those faces in an alternative force choice identification task, people are at chance level, hence the 0% identity. And another series of faces consisted of real identities, well, cartooned identities, but corresponding to 4 different individuals. And through morphing, the continuous series of faces between this 0 identity and original identity, the continuous series was generated with the anti-caricatures and caricatures here. And what I think we can see fairly clearly without need for fancy statistics is that the more the identity strength increases, in particular for, perhaps not so much for this particular phase, but certainly for the 3 others, we can see that the activity of the neuron in the temporal lobe increases, suggesting, as David Leopold has formulated, a norm-based coding of face. That is, coding of face identity as a function of the distance of a particular identity to the prototypical face. Similar phenomenon has been shown in humans using fMRI, where if you measure the activity in FFA in response to, again, faces that vary in identity strength from a kind of identity-neutral stimulus to marked identity, we see the same phenomenon with increasing activity in the fusiform face area the more you are away from the prototypical face. So the question we ask is the similarity between face and voice that we can see at different levels translate to the representation of identity? Do we see a norm-based coding mechanism of voice identity? Perhaps it's useful here to do a very brief reminder of the principle of voice production. So the voice is essentially the result of the interaction between a source that is in the larynx, the vocal folds that oscillate periodically, that are modified by a filter, an acoustical filter in the vocal tract. The sound that is generated by the vocal folds sounds like this. It's kind of a buzzing sound with fairly regular spectrum, and we don't hear it like this precisely because some of the frequencies are changed by the tissues above the vocal tract, and depending on the configuration of the articulators, well, different frequencies are enhanced. The frequencies that are enhanced are called formants, and different formants correspond to different phonemes. So if you take the same glottal pulses and apply them to different filters corresponding to different configuration of the articulators, you hear this. The point is that across different individuals, there is variability both at many different levels in a vocal production system, both in terms of the source. So for example, males have larger vocal folds, so their pitch is lower, but also in the spectral, in the filtering aspects, where, for example, because the vocal tract of males is larger on average than that of female, the formant frequencies are also more largely spaced in males and female, and so on. And that applies to also the difference between individuals of the same gender. So what we did in that study, and the lead author of the study is Marianne Latinus, who's here, so I encourage you to discuss that with her later on, is to try to first define an acoustical space of voice, perhaps comparable to the feature space that was presented earlier. But this time, we concentrated on three simple features of voice. One is the fundamental frequency of phonation, so the number of oscillation of the vocal fold, the pitch of the voice, the F0, fundamental frequency, which can be seen here. The second parameter was related to the filtering, so it's the average spacing between formants, or so-called formant dispersion, which is related to roughly the size of the vocal tract. And the third acoustical parameter, again, that's fairly easy to measure, is the harmonic to noise ratio. How much are the harmonics different from the background noise? It's a measure of regularity. And all three measures, F0, formant dispersion, and HNR, can be very readily extracted from Pratt, for example, and allowing us to take a number of different stimuli, a number of different voices from different individuals, uttering, for example, a single syllable, and place these stimuli as points in the multidimensional, in the three-dimensional space that we define based on the acoustics. So here we put the male and female voices in the same space because what we plot is the Z-score, the variation, but if not, we would have, of course, the male and female voices fairly separated in space. But here, all the analyses were done in parallel on male and female, but without mixing them together. So different voices, depending on their actual configuration, occupy different portions of the space. Now, what we need to do to put in the space is the average voice. Where is it sitting? Well, intuitively, we could think, well, it's sitting in the center of the space, obviously. But in fact, when we actually do the average voice, thanks to morphing, a technique that now, like for faces, allows us to take natural recordings of voices and generate a continuous series of stimuli that happen to all sound like voices and which allow really to control well the acoustical differences, whereby the acoustical difference between two consecutive stimuli is exactly the same at different points of the continuum. Using this technique, it's possible now to average all our stimuli, so our 32 heads, to generate a prototypical head that sounds like a head, but perhaps much more regular and standard. And when we do the measures, so we extract the F0, the formant dispersion, and the HNR of the stimulus, it turns out that it's placed at the top of the space. Why? Because, well, the F0 is average, because it's a linear combination of the F0s of the individual voices. Same thing for the phonon dispersion. But the HNR, the harmonic to noise ratio, has been, in fact, artificially improved by the averaging. If you look at the average stimulus, it's very clear here that it's much smoother in texture than the individual voices that have all these little irregularities. So this is why this stimulus there has a very high harmonic to noise ratio and is sitting on top of the space. Now we've got our average voice, we've got the individual voices. So the prediction of the norm-based coding is that when you measure the distance between any single voice and the average voice, that should give us an indication of, well, the neuronal response. Before this, we first wanted to compare to make sure that this distance to mean defined acoustically has some sense psychologically as well. Actually, that was a suggestion of Stefan Schweinberger to do this. So we asked subjects to rate the distinctiveness of the stimuli and relate them to their distance to mean, and about half of the variance in the distinctiveness is explained by the distance to mean. So showing that this definition of distance to mean has some sense, at least psychologically. Now, how about neurally? We measured in a group of subjects the temporal voice area, so that's the number of voxels that on average are selective to voices in that group of subjects. And for each of the voxel, we're going to measure the relation between distance to mean of a given voice and activity elicited by that voice in that voxel. And the prediction is that, well, we should see a positive correlation, meaning voices that are far away from the average should elicit a larger signal, a larger bold signal in the voice area. What we see here is then the map of Spearman correlation in each of the voxels of the voice area. Those voxels showing a significant correlation between bold signal in response to different voices and their distance to mean. And here is what we see in the most, well, the voxel showing the strongest response, that as predicted, voices that have a larger distance to mean, that are farther, more acoustically different from the prototype, are also eliciting a higher bold signal. This effect can be shown at the level of individual subjects, showing that it's fairly robust, and it will replicate it using different stimuli.
Hello. Hello.
Sorry.
Hello.
Scottish hellos.
Hello.
Can generate an average Scottish hello,
Hello.
and again place it in an average space and calculate distance to mean and compare it to the bold signal, and again we see this effect. In the final experiment in this paper, what we did is, instead of relying on natural variation in distance to mean, we explicitly manipulated distance to mean to see if bold signal would change in the predicted direction. So we took individual voices and moved them towards the average voice, so anti-caricaturing by 50% or caricaturing them by 50%. Equal amounts of acoustical change, but one closer to the norm, to the average, the other not. And the prediction would be, of course, that those voices in light gray that have been moved away from the average, even though they've been moved by comparable amounts of acoustical change to those that have been moved closer to the average here, would show higher bold signal, and this is what we find. So overall, fairly strong confirmation that yes, it seems that the auditory system uses a norm-based coding strategy, very similar to the face system, to represent voice identity. In the last part of the talk, I'd like to focus on aspects that are perhaps not well represented in the Bruce and Young model, things related to personality, to social perception, the fact that we attribute personality traits to faces. And in particular, faces are deemed more or less attractive. And I'm showing this here because this is these are faces that are generated by averaging a large number of individual faces together by computer. And most observers tend to think that these faces are more attractive than the individual faces they were composed of. This is in fact a phenomenon that is known since contemporaries of Darwin, that were already superimposing different individuals on the same photographic plates and finding that they were quite attractive. And it's been replicated a number of times. There's essentially two main accounts of this. One is the good genes, the fact that these beautiful faces, in fact, because they are more smooth, symmetrical, and close to the average, in fact, signal fitness, signal better reproductive potential in a person. There's also another more cognitive account, the perceptual fluency, the fact that we would prefer these stimuli because they're closer to the prototype and so easier to process. There's still debate in this, what of these two explanations is right, and perhaps it's a mix of the two. What's important is that both predict that the same phenomenon should be found for voices. So we set out to test this, again by averaging an increasing number of voices together and asking subjects to rate their attractiveness. And what we find independently for male and female voices is for the level of averaging 1, that is just a single voice, well, we see a distribution of attractiveness with most of the voices of average attractiveness, but some fairly attractive, some fairly unattractive. Same for male and female. And what we see when we increase the number of averaging is this phenomenon where, in a highly significant manner, the more faces we put in a composite, voices, the more attractive the voice is. In fact, when you compare the results to those observed by faces, it's really compelling to see the similarity. In fact, initially when I first came across this particular face study, I thought that my student who was doing the work had simply copied and pasted the points from the face because they are so similar. But illustrating really the similarity between the mechanism of face and voice. We went further in this study by identifying 2 separate acoustical correlates of attractiveness that again can be really directly transposed to the facial aspects. One is the smoothness or the texture regularity, one could say. If you take a voice, we can make it smoother by moving it, just the texture, making it closer to the average voice, so removing a little bit of these irregularities, or on the contrary, exaggerating these irregularities. And when we do this, so here's the individual voice, the smoother voice, and the rougher. And clearly, overwhelmingly, when we present these stimuli in pair and ask subjects to decide which they find most attractive, overwhelmingly they prefer the smoother. Suggesting that, yes, smoothness is one important determinant of voice attractiveness. But there's an orthogonal one, which is the distance to mean, very similar to the one I was presenting earlier. The more you average stimuli together, well, the more they get closer to the average, mathematically, simply because you add by this phenomenon of linear combination. So again, when you manipulate these effects, you see that there's an important determinant of distance to mean in attractiveness. Even, in fact, in the original voices, that the one that have not been averaged, the closer they are to the average, the more attractive they are. And this is even more significant when you add to this the composite voices. So both two independent effects of attractiveness, one is smoothness and the other distance to mean. And again, those 2 effects map directly on similar determinants of facial attractiveness that have been observed. We'll skip this. We've done a study on trying to investigate the neural correlates of the effects, and what we see is that there is a very, very strong negative correlation with vocal attractiveness, especially in the temporal lobe, but also in the right inferior frontal lobe. And this can be explained by, again, 2 acoustical parameters, one being the distance to mean, and the other the HNR, or the smoothness. But even when you remove at distance and harmonic noise ratio from the attractiveness, you still observe a significant relation, particularly in the frontal lobe, suggesting that there could be an abstract representation of attractiveness that is no more dependent on acoustics in the inferior frontal gyrus. I'd like to finish the talk on this slide by Alex Todorov and his group, where they've shown that across a number of different faces of individuals, you can really model the impressions of personality along many different traits, you can model them in a simple two-dimensional space, with one dimension being trustworthiness and the other being dominance. And well, if this is the average neutral phase, then the average trustworthiness phase really is here, and this is the untrustworthiness, and the same for dominant and undominant. And these two-dimensional models captures most of the variability, most of the variance in personality traits ratings. Again, we asked whether this could apply to some extent to the voice perception, and we asked subjects, we investigated how people say hello.
Hello, 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 hello.
Well, in all these different hellos, clearly there are some, when you hear them, you make an impression of personality. So to capture this, we asked subjects, a large number of subjects, to rate via online ratings these voices, these different hellos on a number of different traits, and through data reduction methods, principal compression analysis, we found that very similar to the work done in faces by Todorov and colleagues, most of the relation, most of the traits, the variance in these different personality traits can be mapped to a two-dimensional space, and that the two main components of those space map exactly as for the faces on trustworthiness and dominance. This is true for the male faces, but also for the female voices, sorry. With the only difference actually between the male and female voices is that concern attractiveness, where attractiveness clusters in the male with dominance and competence, but clusters with likability, trust, and warmth in the female. So if you're a female and want to sound attractive, you need to speak in a warm and trustworthy way, whereas if you're a male and want to sound attractive, you need to speak in a dominant and competent way. Now, the obvious question is, how do we do that? How do you speak in a competent way? Well, this is just work in progress, and I'll finish on this, where by generating a large number of random voices through morphing and asking people to rate these stimuli, you can in a method akin to reverse correlation, we can extract the prototypes of personality traits, and if this is the average stimulus, so the one that doesn't correspond to any strong or impression of trustworthiness or not, we can then find the two extremes of the distribution in very low trustworthiness ratings corresponding to this voice. That sounds something like this. But more interestingly, the high trustworthiness. So how do females have to say hello to be perceived as very, very trustworthy?
Hello, 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 hello.
And we can illustrate this difference by making a slight movie. So where with 7 different stimuli, where the central stimulus is the average stimulus, these ones and these ones are the prototypes, and we can even exaggerate the difference by having caricature of low trustworthiness and caricatures of high trustworthiness. And that's a really interesting way to have a handle of what are the underlying acoustics on this.
Hello, 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 hello.
So clearly we see that pitch has an importance. The lower the pitch is, the more trustworthy the female voice is perceived, but also the intonation. You have to have some marked intonation with the pitch going up towards the end. So I wanted to leave you with this work in progress, and but which compellingly demonstrate that yes, this approach on prototypes influence dramatically the results. In green, you have the ratings for these 7 different stimuli. Actually, there's 9 of them here, but it's different compared to blue continuum, where this variation was not demonstrated. So clearly, we can modify the impression of trustworthiness by using this prototype approach. Well, thank you very much, and thank my colleagues and collaborators and students in Glasgow, but also now more recently in Marseille, where I'm setting up a new lab. And I want to acknowledge my sources of funding as well. Thank you.
So the talk is open for discussion. Is this on? Yes. I don't know if you've studied what makes the male voice more trustworthy sounding, but I'm wondering if the more feminine voice, the more trustworthy sounding female voice is more prototypically feminine?
Yeah, that's interesting. Indeed, that's what the impression we have when looking at the result of Todorov, that the most trustworthy male face, although they didn't really look into the gender differences in that paper, but indeed the more trustworthy male face seems very feminine. This is not what we find with the voices. It seems that low pitch is still very important in the perception of trustworthiness. Of course, it's more important, even more important in the perception of dominance, but still plays an important role in perception of trustworthiness.
I think there's some evidence that women raise the pitch of their voice at the end of utterances more than men do, even though their mean pitch is higher. So the inflection part might be more typically feminine. I don't know.
Which might explain part of these results, yeah.
In that model of how do you describe with 3 parameters the auditory stimuli? You just clapped them together to describe the distance, the mean. But did you try to model actually behavioral response or behavioral description by subjects based on those 3 parameters? Because they are probably different in terms of, like, they're not linear dependent.
Yeah, well, that's a really good point. In fact, the original idea of the face space put forward by Valentine was not at all based on physical measurement. I think he had more in mind behavioral measures of discrimination between different faces, for example. Well, we chose this approach because it has the merit of being quite simple, but because also before we had done the work of going through dissimilarity ratings of a large number of pairs of voice stimuli and finding out through PCA that boils down to a small number of acoustical parameters, including F0 and Pheromone dispersion. So, yeah.
And another question. Whenever you averaged voices, they were voices of different people, right? If you average the same person, does it become more attractive?
We have not tested that. What we've tested, though, and this is work by Marianne, is that the stimulus become more recognizable. And this is really similar to work done by Mike Burton with the many different faces of the same individual. When you average together these different faces, and I think John Travolta is the prototypical example in Mike Burton's work, this average John Travolta is recognized much better and much faster by individuals compared to the individual images. And it seems that it's the case as well when we identify morph together different syllables of the same person. We end up with this kind of bizarre schwa stimulus that turns out to be very, very recognizable with a much faster recognition rate. So, yes.
So I was wondering if you might comment about a potential fundamental difference between voices and faces. So I can see a face even if the person doesn't want to show the face to me, but the voice I can only hear if the person decides to speak. Yeah. And so I wonder if there might be a fundamental difference between the importance of structural features and changeable features.
Mm-hmm. That's interesting because, of course, we like to emphasize the similarity between face and voice. That sounds a little bit counterintuitive given the very different nature in the nature of the sensory input. But it's true that in terms of the social life, they are fairly complementary. When sometimes you cannot see the face because, well, it's either obscured or it's dark, but still the voice can transfer this information. So there are contexts in which one source of information can be much more informative than the other. Independently of that, when people ask me this question, typically they emphasize these temporal aspects. Faces are static, whereas voice is dynamic. And this is often the case that I have this question, and here I don't agree entirely. In fact, this is a reason why we focus on very brief stimuli, is to try to, a little bit like face researchers, use static pictures of faces as proxy to study the perception of real faces that are dynamic, that change in time. A little bit here, we also try to minimize the effect of time to look at the stimuli. But clearly, this is a limitation. It would be interesting to go to more longer, more naturalistic utterances.
So
sure if I understood, if I replied
Yes,
to your
my question was more in the direction is like the trustworthiness of the voice.
The what, sorry?
The trustworthiness of the voice.
Uh-huh.
I might be focusing more because it's a current instantiation of my current mood. I might be focusing more on like whether the voice is trembling or is too high in pitch for that person. So like changeable aspects might play a larger role, while in Alex's works of the structural features of the face that would not change on a moment-by-moment basis might be the source of trustworthiness.
That's a very good point. Yeah, I need to investigate that.
Yeah, thanks, Pascal. Excellent data, and I just would like to go on that slide, and my question relates also a bit to the second to previous question. You've been very careful to label this the averaged voice rather than the average voice, and I think this is probably wise because you told us that the harmonic to noise ratio is increased by averaging. So in a way, and this is not a problem unique to voice research, of course, it also applies, in my understanding, to the averaging of faces, but what happens through the digital averaging process is that you just make the stimulus a lot smoother. Mm-hmm. And so in a sense, I'm just wondering, this is a problem we also have, and we haven't solved it yet. So I just wonder, what's your opinion on whether we shouldn't try to actually improve this kind of averaging process in a sense of maybe reinventing some aperiodicity, for instance, by adding some stochastic type of noise and jitter or shimmer in those averaged voices to actually make them a real average voice. I mean, do you think this is a viable way to do it? I'd just like to hear your opinion on this.
No, this is a very interesting point. Now it would be, so we've got this average voice. So features like the F0, formal dispersion, we know they're average, they are linearly combined, so that's not a problem. Yes, indeed, this average voice has a higher harmonic noise ratio. What happens if we take a voice in the middle, exactly as you say, taking the average, so taking this averaged voice, but sticking onto it a normal pattern of aperiodicity, either one that you generate or, easier, one that you copy from a natural voice. We tried this, so in fact we used an average voice, so a voice that will really at the center of the space this time, because it has average also a periodicity. And when we looked at the relation with this new distance to the real center of the space, nearly no variance at all is explained in the ratings or in the neural activity, suggesting that it's not, well, we are lucky in a sense to have this artifact and to use this unnatural average voice, because it turns out that it seems to be closer to the internal prototype that we have, an average voice in terms of size and pitch, but idealized without all the individual fluctuations that characterize natural voices. A little bit like the average face is really, well, the prototypical face, but without the little spots that everybody has, you know, these different things. But yeah, and as you know, the morphing thing allows now to independently manipulate aspects of aperiodicity compared to pitch or spectral dimension. So we can, and you are already playing with this, I know. We can ask many interesting questions around this.
Are the more attractive voices sort of higher in resonance, and does that increase, or higher in harmonics, and does that increase neural resonance, which would, you know, sort of reduce neural energy expenditures and cause liking?
I'm not sure what you call by resonance.
So the attractive voices would probably have higher, more power in the harmonics, right?
Yeah.
And thereby they would increase neural resonance. My voice is cracking for some reason. So, I would predict that there would be higher neural synchrony listening to attractive voices compared to unattractive voices, for example.
That's a very interesting suggestion. We have not done that.
You haven't tested the synchrony at all? Or?
No, we've only so far used fMRI, but definitely, yes, electrophysiological measures would be very interesting. Certainly, what we show, again, is that there seems to be two independent acoustical parameters that influence attractiveness. One is the distance to mean, so really how this F0 and formal dispersion, how it differs from the center. And one that is independent is your level of harmonicity. And the two, manipulating the two independently, manipulate also the attractiveness. Now, I should also add that exactly as for faces, averageness is not all of attractiveness. There are some highly unaverage faces / voices that are also deemed very attractive. So clearly we don't explain all of attractiveness by these parameters, but certainly we explain a lot already.
So I had a question about the last slide that you presented, the trustworthiness of the female voices. And I was wondering if you would speculate a little bit about what drives that particular, so this sort of right extreme there, why that female voice seemed to be the most trustworthy. So I was wondering if it has any relationship with first exposure to voices in the womb, because the womb would act sort of like a low-pass filter, and I wonder, we sort of have that exposure to voices, unlike faces, very, very early in development.
Yeah, that's a very good point. Could we predict what a trustworthy voice should sound like? That's a way to reformulate your question. I don't know. I mean, I think now we have the method to identify what it sounds like, what it turns out to sound like, and a posteriori try to make a story. Oh yes, there's more, variation, but certainly my knowledge, my understanding is not sufficient. I don't think anyone could really predict, to be trustworthy it should be this and that and that. And in fact, it's interesting to see that there are commonalities but also differences. I only showed the female, but if you listen to the male, it's quite different. It also differs on what trait you're interested in, trustworthiness, dominance, and so on. I don't know, there are many interesting questions, but now I wouldn't be able to speculate on why this particular shape of the stimulus is deemed more trustworthy.
So I wonder if the individual differences in what people would report as the most trustworthy voice could be at all share a relationship with the voice of their parent, like their mother or something. We could use that to predict at least individual differences there.
That's a very good point. Actually, this is another determinant of attractiveness. Apparently, the similarity for the face, at least, similarity to your own parent's face. So certainly, this could play a role. And as you rightly point out, we are exposed much earlier than for faces. In fact, in utero, already there's a lot of data suggesting that there's a fine sensitivity of the fetus to voice modulation. So, yeah. Yes.
I think the trustworthiness dominance that it maps on with the faces is really exciting. So earlier this week, studies that have modeled faces using ambient natural facial images have actually found a third dimension. It was in PNAS either this week or last week, showing that a youthful attractiveness dimension seems to be separate. And what they did was they used a much more diverse sample of faces that were actually natural. So I'm wondering if you use maybe a diverse set of voices, if you might find that, or have you explored that? And do you think it could be a third dimension?
Well, yes, certainly a third and fourth. I mean, clearly attractiveness is a very complex and multi-emotional percept that is heavily influenced by context in particular. If you attractiveness for a short-term dating or for a job interview is very different. It reminds me, I was not aware of that study that you mentioned, but I've seen one earlier from Todorov's group with again analyzing a wide range of natural faces, like thousands, and making fairly detailed statistics and statistical analysis show effects, for example, that averageness in a shape is attractive, but not averageness in a texture, and that, on the contrary, if you are farther away from the average in texture, it's better, at least for males. So, yeah, clearly, the next step for this would be exactly as you suggest, now looking at a much broader range of voices, not just 32 like here, but a much larger number. And
okay, so was it 16 men, 16 women?
No, 32 male, 32 female.
Okay.
Yeah. Yes.
That's simple. All right, so to kind of continue with this conversation about the trustworthiness dominance thing, one thing that really interests me is that the trustworthiness dominance dimensions, when you think about them with faces, there's this big constraint of the fact that we're trying to look at how these faces can vary in certain cues that are independent of emotion cues and certain other things, whereas I feel like a voice has a lot more to it than a face in that sense. And for instance, cues with a voice that might have to do with your state or other things might not be independent of cues that have to do with your identity or other traits or aspects that you have. So I wonder, when I look at the trustworthiness dominance thing, one thing I've always thought of research that does this is they seem to ask items that all happen to be synonyms of words that mean trustworthiness versus dominance. I wonder if you threw more odd personality traits into this, you could get kind of dimensions. For instance, you imagine like how articulate someone is could reflect intelligence over competence, and it could be more independent. And,
No, that's a really good point. And here again, there's many different approaches. Some people just focus on the big 5 personality traits, but on the other extreme, you could take like literally hundreds of different traits. We used about 10, really being inspired by the work of Todorov, and so maybe it's not surprising that we find the same dimensions. You make the point of the relation with emotion, which I didn't elaborate on, but this is really interesting. Although all these faces are so-called neutral, at least the individual faces on which these models have been built were all neutral faces, it turns out that particularly for the trustworthiness dimension, it looks like there's an emotion. Like really this untrustworthy guy is really angry, whereas in fact it's still a neutral face, but he looks angry simply by the configuration of the traits, and at the opposite, the guy looks fairly happy or whatnot. We did the same analysis, and we didn't have an effect as clear-cut as this one. In fact, there were several different emotions that were responding. So we ended up removing that from the paper because it was not consistent. Alex Todorov wanted us to do that experiment. It could have been fantastic to find exactly, it turns out that the voices that sound untrustworthy are also there's an obvious trait like, I don't know, size or, which actually it does. But in terms of the emotion, there was no clear emotion that was attached to untrustworthiness, unlike in that particular study. So that might be a point of difference.
Well, I was just thinking that's kind of fascinating because I feel like one of the main explanations for all these kinds of effects is overgeneralization. So do you have anywhere where you could possibly go next, theoretically, to try to explain what could underlie those dimensions if it's not overgeneralization with voices?
I'm not sure.
Well, I also wonder whether if you use longer stimuli, and I know you're trying to keep it short, but if you use longer stimuli in a more diverse sample set, whether you would have more opportunities to get emotion cues into the voice, and then it might show up as a kind of overgeneralization effect or something like that.
Possibly, although interestingly, some effects, like for example the effect of averaging on attractiveness, disappears completely when you use longer stimuli. Perhaps, for example, simply because the pitch, when you take longer stimuli and average lots of different stimuli, then you end up with a flat pitch, and that sounds really, robotic and natural and unattractive. So although this effect, averageness, is very clear on brief stimuli, it becomes less true for longer. So yeah, there's very, very interaction between many different factors. We should continue discussing because I'd like to have your ideas on how we could continue this. Yes.
Well, talking about the relationship between face and voice, we all had this experience where you listen to the radio and there's a very nice voice, very attractive voice, and one day you see the face of the person, and it can be completely incongruent. Yeah. So it's quite funny the fact that when you look at someone, it's very hard to predict what the kind of voice they're going to have. So it's usually surprising. So as you're making the point that you have the same parameters, so someone can have an attractive face, but may not have an attractive voice. It's a bit strange in terms of evolution, because if you're talking only in terms of reproduction, like you were talking, it's like someone has to be attractive, but if two parameters are not fitting, if I see a very extremely beautiful lady, but she has a very silly voice, what will happen?
Exactly. So this is a very good point. And perhaps Stefan would like to contribute to the discussion, because I know he's also working on these things. I've lost it now. What was the...
Let me just ask quickly, do we know, is there a correlation between facial
exactly.
attractiveness?
So there is a lot, across the general population, there is overall, yes, a correlation between facial and vocal attractiveness. However, there are interesting exceptions, and sometimes we focus on these exceptions. I say Susan Boyle because Susan Boyle is this Scottish singer. You may have heard about her, and she was all over the news. Well, she has a beautiful voice, but I'm sure you've heard much more beautiful voice. What was really interesting is that she really was ugly, and that struck the journalists so much that this contrast between the facial and vocal attractiveness made. So illustrating your point, So that bears on the theory behind. I mean, if it's really the good genes, if really what determines your attractiveness is the genetic pool, well, then it should show equally in the face and the voice and in other aspects of the body. And well, it seems that it's the case in the general population, but there is this exception suggesting that it might not always be, as clear-cut as this.
I assume that youth is quite. You very rarely see a young person that sounds old, or a very old person that sounds young. So at least evolution is quite consistent.
Certainly, attractiveness is really well correlated with a young age. Interestingly, it seems that trustworthiness is correlated to old age. I think this is data that I've seen from Andy Young recently.